In the years leading up to the infamous events of August 1892, the Borden family of Fall River, Massachusetts, presented a public image of stability and modest success. Andrew Borden, the patriarch, was a wealthy man by the standards of the time, having made his fortune in real estate and banking. Yet despite his considerable wealth, Andrew was notoriously frugal. He refused to upgrade the family home with modern amenities, such as indoor plumbing, which was becoming standard in homes of similar stature. The Borden house, located at 92 2nd Street, was practical and secure but austere, a reflection of Andrew's rigid and penny-pinching ways. This decision to live simply, despite the means for comfort, sowed seeds of resentment within the family, particularly in his daughters, Lizzie and Emma. The emotional atmosphere within the Borden home was far from harmonious. Lizzie and her older sister Emma were the daughters of Andrew's first wife, Sarah, who died when Lizzie was just a toddler. Not long after, Andrew married Abby Durfee Gray, a woman the girls never truly accepted as their stepmother. To Lizzie, Abby was not a maternal figure but an outsider, someone who had married into the family but had not earned a place in her heart. Lizzie reportedly never referred to Abby as mother, only as Mrs. Borden, and tension between the two women simmered for years. Emma, who was more passive and less involved in household conflicts, shared many of Lizzie's sentiments toward Abby, further isolating the stepmother in her own home. This lack of affection was made worse by disputes over property and inheritance. When Andrew gave a piece of valuable real estate to Abby's relatives, a house that had previously belonged to Lizzie and Emma's mother, it enraged the daughters. In response, Andrew gave a similar property to the girls, but the damage was already done. Lizzie and Emma began to feel that Abby was manipulating their father for financial gain. These suspicions only deepened the emotional chasm that already divided the household. By the summer of 1892, the Borden home was fraught with hostility and mistrust. The internal dynamics had become so toxic that the sisters began avoiding meals with their father and stepmother. Lizzie, in particular, withdrew socially and emotionally. She was in her early 30s, unmarried, and still living at home, a fact that carried social stigma at the time. This situation added another layer of frustration to her life. While she was active in her church and various charitable organizations, Lizzie's personal life seemed increasingly constrained, governed by her father's tight control over household finances and decisions. The days leading up to the murders were especially tense. A family argument, reportedly over a minor household matter, led Emma to leave for a trip to Fairhaven, leaving Lizzie alone in the emotionally charged atmosphere. Lizzie allegedly had an argument with both her father and Abby over matters not publicly disclosed, though family servants later testified about rising tension and cold silences. Compounding this strained environment was a mysterious illness that swept through the household just days before the murders. Bridget Sullivan, the Bordens' live-in maid, also known as Maggie, believed they had been poisoned. Abby herself had reportedly gone to a doctor complaining of stomach issues and fear of poisoning. Though the illness was attributed to spoiled mutton left out on the stove, the paranoia it introduced further escalated household anxiety. Within this claustrophobic and emotionally charged space, Lizzie's movements and moods became increasingly erratic. She was seen burning a dress in the days after the murders, claiming it had been stained with paint. She also stopped calling Abby Mrs. Borden in public and began speaking of her in past tense even before the funeral had taken place. Her strange behavior did not go unnoticed by law enforcement or the public. Yet those who knew Lizzie described her as refined, religious, and incapable of violence, a perfect example of how appearances, especially those shaped by class and gender, can mask deep psychological fractures. The Borden family's internal divisions weren't merely private matters, they formed the foundation upon which the murder case was built. To understand the motivations, or lack thereof, behind one of the most infamous crimes in American history, one must begin not with bloodied hatchets or courtroom dramas, but with the quiet, corrosive tensions of a home that looked respectable from the outside, but was rotting from within. The morning of August 4, 1892, in Fall River, Massachusetts, began like any other humid summer day. At the Borden residence on 2nd Street, the household stirred early. Andrew Borden, a creature of routine, rose around 6 a.m., as was his habit. Bridget Sullivan, the live-in maid, had already begun her morning chores despite suffering from the lingering effects of the mysterious illness that had plagued the house in the days prior. Abby Borden, Andrew's wife and stepmother to Lizzie and Emma, was also awake, moving about the house and attending to her daily tasks. Emma, notably, was not in the home, having traveled to Fairhaven a few days earlier. That left Lizzie, Abby, Andrew, and Bridget as the only occupants of the house on that fateful morning. The house was oddly still despite the morning bustle. Abby reportedly planned to visit a sick friend, and Andrew intended to go into town for his usual business errands. Around 7 a.m., Andrew had his breakfast, joined by Abby and Bridget, though Lizzie was conspicuously absent. Bridget later recounted that Lizzie rarely ate with the family and did not come down until later that morning. Lizzie's presence in the kitchen was brief. She claimed she was not feeling well and did not eat, but her mood was described as calm and composed. Shortly after breakfast, Andrew left for his business appointments. Abby remained in the house and is believed to have gone upstairs to tidy the guest bedroom. It was in that room, sometime between 9 o'clock and 10:30 a.m., that she met her violent end. The attacker struck her repeatedly with a hatchet-like weapon, landing at least 18 blows, primarily to the back of her head and neck. The sheer brutality suggested rage rather than a simple intent to kill. Her body was discovered face down between the bed and the wall, her skull partially caved in. Meanwhile, Andrew returned home around 10:45 a.m. Bridget, having finished washing the windows in the sweltering heat, was resting in her attic bedroom. According to her testimony, Lizzie told her that Mr. Borden had returned and that he had trouble getting into the house because the door had been jammed. Lizzie claimed to have been in the kitchen or the barn at different points during this time, giving conflicting accounts that would later draw scrutiny. She greeted her father upon his return and told him that Mrs. Borden had gone out to visit a sick friend. Andrew then lay down for a nap on the sitting room couch, completely unaware that his wife was already dead upstairs. It was sometime between 10:45 a.m. and 11:10 a.m. that Andrew, too, was killed. The attacker struck him with immense force, 10 or 11 times, while he was lying on the couch. One of the blows split his eyeball, indicating he had been facing his killer or was at least partly aware of the attack. The murder was savage, direct, and fast. Blood soaked the couch and pooled around the floor, creating a grisly scene. Yet, no one outside the house heard a scream, a struggle, or even a cry for help. At around 11:10 a.m., Lizzie called out to Bridget, claiming her father had been murdered. Bridget, still resting, came down to witness the gruesome sight. Lizzie then told Bridget not to go upstairs, where Abby's body still lay undiscovered. Soon after, Lizzie sent Bridget to fetch Dr. Bowen, the family's physician, and also notified a neighbor, Mrs. Adelaide Churchill. Dr. Bowen arrived within minutes, quickly realizing the severity of the situation. Despite Lizzie's insistence that a strange man had come into the house and killed her father, there were no signs of forced entry, no valuables missing, and no blood trails leading out of the house. As more people arrived, neighbors, police, doctors, the confusion and horror intensified. When someone finally checked the upstairs guest room, Abby's body was discovered. This revelation changed the situation dramatically. There were now 2 murders in the same house, just hours apart, and the timeframe placed Lizzie as the only person unaccounted for during both periods. She claimed to have been in the barn loft looking for a piece of lead to use for fishing sinkers during the time of Andrew's murder, though an examination of the loft found no footprints in the thick dust. Her timeline shifted slightly in different retellings, adding to the suspicions. Her calm demeanor during the chaos and her odd statements about a supposed stranger led many to question what had truly happened in that house during the quiet, violent morning. In the immediate aftermath of the murders, Lizzie Borden's behavior began raising eyebrows among law enforcement, neighbors, and even members of her own household. From the moment she alerted Bridget to her father's murder, Lizzie's emotional state appeared oddly subdued. Rather than displaying the shock and hysteria expected of someone who had just discovered her father brutally murdered on the parlor couch, Lizzie remained composed. She directed Bridget and the neighbors to summon help, calmly repeated her story to the police when they arrived, and answered questions with a coolness that seemed disconnected from the horror surrounding her. When questioned by officers at the scene, Lizzie claimed she had been out in the barn loft looking for fishing sinkers when her father was killed. She said she had been up there for 15 to 20 minutes and then returned to the house to discover Andrew's mutilated body. However, officers found the loft to be stifling hot and filled with undisturbed dust, showing no signs of recent activity or footprints. Additionally, there were no fishing lines or equipment in sight. Her explanation did not align with the physical evidence, and her timing seemed too precise. Suspicion grew, yet the officers initially hesitated to treat her as a suspect because of her gender, social status, and reputation within the community. Her actions over the following hours only deepened the mystery. Lizzie changed clothes shortly after the murders, a decision that would become central to the investigation. Bridget noted that Lizzie had been wearing a blue dress in the morning but later appeared in a different outfit. Several days later, a family friend named Alice Russell witnessed Lizzie burning a dress in the kitchen stove. Lizzie explained it had been ruined with paint, but the timing of the destruction raised serious concerns. Many believed she may have been disposing of blood-stained evidence, especially since no bloody clothing was ever found in the house despite the grotesque violence of the killings. Throughout her interviews, Lizzie gave conflicting details about her whereabouts and the timeline of events. At one point, she told investigators she had gone outside and heard a groan, then quickly said she had not heard anything at all. In another moment, she insisted Abby had received a note and gone out to visit a sick friend, although no note was ever found and Abby's body had likely been in the house for over an hour before Andrew was killed. These inconsistencies made it difficult for investigators to take her account at face value. While some believed her confusion could have been the result of trauma, others saw it as a calculated attempt to control the narrative. Her demeanor during the inquest was another point of concern. Observers described her as detached and cold, even when shown crime scene photographs or asked directly about the killings. She did not display visible grief for either her father or stepmother, nor did she inquire much about the investigation's progress. She remained oddly focused on the note she claimed Abby received, often redirecting questions back to that detail as if trying to anchor the story to something she couldn't fully explain. At one point, she even corrected investigators about the layout of the house or the positioning of furniture, revealing a level of awareness that contradicted her claim of being unaware of the events upstairs. Adding to the complexity of her behavior was the presence of morphine in her system. Dr. Bowen, the family physician, had administered doses of morphine to help calm Lizzie following the murders. Morphine was a common sedative at the time, but it could also cloud memory and impair coherent speech. Some of Lizzie's evasive and disjointed answers during questioning were attributed to this drug. Yet, others argued that her composure and sharp corrections during the same period suggested she was far more lucid than her defenders claimed. Lizzie's relationships with others in the house also factored into the suspicion. Her open disdain for Abby was well known, and her refusal to call her mother indicated a long-standing divide. Her statements about Abby being not my mother were delivered with what some described as quiet bitterness. Moreover, Bridget Sullivan recalled that tensions had been running especially high in the days before the murders, with arguments erupting between Lizzie, Abby, and Andrew. Lizzie had even allegedly avoided eating meals with the family and confined herself to her room for long stretches, signaling a potential buildup of resentment or emotional strain. As the days passed and the investigation deepened, the community's perception of Lizzie shifted. Once seen as a demure church-going woman, she became the center of a storm of speculation. Newspapers reported her actions with growing skepticism, and rumors of her coldness and contradictions circulated quickly. Despite having no direct witnesses to the murders and no clear motive beyond family tension, Lizzie's suspicious behavior began to define the public narrative, casting her not as a grieving daughter but as someone with something to hide. The trial of Lizzie Borden began on June 5, 1893, in New Bedford, Massachusetts, and immediately captivated the nation. It was one of the first trials in American history to generate coast-to-coast media coverage, a legal spectacle that blurred the line between crime and entertainment. Reporters filled the courtroom, sketch artists captured every expression, and newspapers published daily dispatches that turned Lizzie into a household name. The public was drawn not only to the gruesome details of the murders but also to the enigma of the accused, a young, church-going woman from a respectable family, standing trial for the brutal axe murders of her father and stepmother. From the outset, the prosecution sought to construct a narrative of resentment, rage, and calculated violence. They portrayed Lizzie as a woman trapped in a strained and bitter household, harboring deep animosity toward her stepmother and anger over her father's perceived favoritism and financial decisions. The state's case hinged not on eyewitnesses or a murder weapon, but on circumstantial evidence and inconsistencies in Lizzie's behavior and statements. They pointed to her conflicting alibis, her claim about Abby receiving a mysterious note, her calm demeanor after the murders, and the suspicious burning of a dress days later as key indicators of guilt. The prosecution emphasized the timing of the killings, arguing that no one else could have committed both murders in such a short window without being seen or heard. A major blow to the prosecution came early on when Judge Dewey ruled that Lizzie's inquest testimony would be inadmissible in court. During the inquest, Lizzie had given contradictory answers and appeared confused, but because she had not been informed of her right to remain silent and had no attorney present, her statements were excluded. This decision limited the prosecution's ability to directly present some of the most damaging material against her. Nevertheless, they proceeded to build their case on the circumstantial pieces that remained: her opportunity, her changing story, her motives, and the lack of any other plausible suspect. The defense, led by former Massachusetts Governor George D. Robinson, constructed a starkly different image of Lizzie. They depicted her as a dutiful daughter, a victim of tragic circumstance, and the target of public hysteria rather than legal reason. Robinson emphasized the absence of physical evidence linking her to the crime: no blood on her clothes, no fingerprints on a weapon, no witnesses placing her at either murder scene. He argued that Lizzie had no history of violence and no clear motive strong enough to justify such a heinous act. The defense also focused heavily on the implausibility of a woman of Lizzie's stature committing such brutal crimes without anyone hearing or seeing her. Throughout the trial, Lizzie remained composed, often appearing stoic or dazed. She sat in court dressed in somber black, flanked by supporters, including Emma, her loyal sister. Her appearance and demeanor played a significant role in public perception. Many spectators found it difficult to reconcile the image of the quiet, well-bred woman before them with the violent nature of the crimes. The Victorian ideals of femininity and virtue made it psychologically difficult for many jurors and observers to imagine that a woman like Lizzie could wield a hatchet with such ferocity. Key testimony came from Bridget Sullivan, the maid, who recounted her movements on the day of the murders and her limited interactions with Lizzie. Her account suggested that no stranger could have easily entered or exited the house undetected. However, Bridget did not directly accuse Lizzie and maintained a careful neutrality. The medical examiner's testimony detailed the savage nature of the wounds but could not determine a precise time of death, which further complicated the prosecution's case. The issue of the hatchets found in the basement also became a focal point. One of them, a hatchet head with a broken handle, was believed by police to be the murder weapon. It was covered in dust and appeared to have been deliberately cleaned of blood. But without any forensic science to definitively tie the hatchet to the murders or to Lizzie herself, this key piece of evidence remained speculative. After weeks of testimony, summations, and national fascination, the case went to the jury. Public opinion outside the courtroom was deeply divided. Some believed Lizzie was being protected because of her gender and social class, while others saw her as an innocent woman wrongly accused. As the jurors deliberated, people crowded outside the courthouse, awaiting the outcome. The trial had become more than a criminal proceeding; it had evolved into a referendum on Victorian values, gender roles, and the fragility of appearances. The jurors, all male, were tasked not just with evaluating evidence but with confronting the uncomfortable idea that someone like Lizzie could be guilty of such a crime. The trial of Lizzie Borden unfolded not just in the courtroom but in the collective conscience of a nation grappling with its expectations of gender and class. Victorian society held rigid views of womanhood. Women were expected to be passive, nurturing, and morally pure. The idea that a young, unmarried woman from an upper-middle-class background could be capable of such savage violence clashed with the era's cultural ideals. This dissonance would shape every aspect of the case, from the police investigation to the jury's verdict, and continued to influence public opinion long after the courtroom had emptied. In the eyes of the law and the press, Lizzie was not merely a suspect, she was a puzzle. Her presence challenged societal definitions of what a criminal looked like. The prosecution may have believed her behavior was incriminating, but much of the public saw her poise and self-control as signs of refinement. She was involved in her church, hosted charitable events, and lived a quiet life in a family known for its respectability. Her status as a proper lady of Fall River became both a shield and a source of fascination. While her composure drew suspicion from some investigators, it also endeared her to a segment of the public who could not reconcile the image of a well-bred woman with that of a cold-blooded killer. Class played an equally important role in shaping the investigation and trial. The Borden family was not among the city's elite, but they were certainly well off, especially Andrew, who was known for his financial acumen and property holdings. The family's wealth brought a level of deference from local authorities that may not have been extended to someone of lower status. The Borden name held weight in Fall River, and some believed Lizzie's social position insulated her from the full force of the law. Critics pointed out that a servant or immigrant in Lizzie's place would have been arrested immediately and tried with less ceremony and more condemnation. The way the press covered the trial revealed society's obsession with class and femininity. Newspapers couldn't decide whether to paint Lizzie as a fragile woman wrongfully accused or a clever manipulator hiding behind her petticoats. They fixated on her wardrobe, her posture, her glances. They noted the way she held a handkerchief or looked at the jury. This obsessive focus on her demeanor rather than the facts of the case revealed how deeply gender stereotypes affected perceptions of guilt and innocence. Headlines alternated between condemning her and expressing admiration for her courage and calm. In this respect, Lizzie became a mirror in which Americans saw their cultural biases reflected. Women across the country followed the trial closely, with some seeing Lizzie as a victim of a male-dominated justice system, while others viewed her with horror. Yet the mere possibility that a woman could plan and execute such a crime opened an uncomfortable conversation about the roles women could occupy in society. If a woman like Lizzie Borden could wield a hatchet, then the neat boxes in which Victorian culture placed femininity no longer seemed so secure. This ambiguity is part of what made the case so memorable and so haunting. The expectations of proper womanhood influenced the legal strategy of the defense. Lizzie's attorneys leaned heavily into her gender, presenting her as too delicate, too morally upright to be capable of murder. Her defense team portrayed her as a victim of circumstance, a daughter who had stumbled upon a horrific crime, not the one who caused it. Her quiet demeanor during the trial, rather than being seen as chilling or suspicious, was reframed as the behavior of a woman in shock, mourning her beloved father. The court was encouraged to see her as a daughter wronged, not a murderer acting out of resentment. The jury, composed entirely of men, likely internalized these same societal pressures. Many of them were family men themselves, raised in a culture where women were not seen as violent or capable of the kind of rage the Borden murders exhibited. The brutality of the killings, the multiple axe blows, the precision and repetition, felt incompatible with the era's vision of womanhood. This mismatch between cultural belief and criminal possibility played a critical role in the verdict, as jurors may have struggled not just with the evidence, but with the implications of convicting a woman of such a crime. Public reaction to the trial's outcome further reflected these social dynamics. Some celebrated Lizzie's acquittal as a triumph of justice and morality, while others saw it as a failure of the legal system, influenced more by her gender and status than the evidence at hand. Either way, the case forced Americans to confront uncomfortable questions about who could be a criminal, what justice looked like, and how much appearances should matter when deciding guilt or innocence. In the decades following the trial, Lizzie Borden became more than a defendant in a double murder case. She became a cultural figure, a symbol, a story retold and reshaped across generations. Though she was acquitted by the jury, the cloud of suspicion never truly lifted. In Fall River, where the murders had occurred, Lizzie lived out the rest of her life as a social pariah. Neighbors turned cold, invitations ceased, and whispers followed her wherever she went. Despite her legal exoneration, the community did not forget what had happened, and many refused to believe in her innocence. She and her sister Emma moved out of the family home and purchased a new house in a more affluent part of the city, which they named Maplecroft, perhaps in an effort to start over, but the stigma followed them there. Lizzie attempted to maintain her social status, continuing to involve herself in charitable causes and even traveling, but her public presence was never fully rehabilitated. The very wealth and manners that had once insulated her became reminders of the scandal. Emma eventually moved away from Lizzie after a falling out, likely linked to the ongoing consequences of the trial. Lizzie lived alone for many years and died in 1927, largely forgotten by her former friends and excluded from the community she had once belonged to. Despite her attempt to live a private life, her name remained in the headlines, and the legend around her only continued to grow. Over time, Lizzie Borden's story transitioned from courtroom drama to American folklore. She became a character in books, plays, songs, and eventually films and television. The most enduring cultural artifact associated with her is the eerie children's rhyme, Lizzie Borden took an axe / and gave her mother 40 whacks / when she saw what she had done / she gave her father 41. This macabre verse, though factually inaccurate, neither parent was struck that many times, cemented Lizzie's image in the American imagination as a killer, regardless of the verdict. The rhyme was not contemporary to the trial but emerged in the years after, showing how folklore can often shape public memory more powerfully than facts or verdicts. The fascination with Lizzie only deepened as the years passed. Writers, historians, and amateur sleuths revisited the case again and again, examining trial transcripts, testimonies, and physical evidence with fresh eyes. Each new generation found itself drawn to the mystery, trying to reconcile the respectable image of Lizzie with the horror of the crimes. Speculative theories multiplied. Some believed Bridget Sullivan may have been involved or even responsible, others suspected Emma, the sister with a potential motive and a perfect alibi. Still others speculated that Lizzie had suffered a psychological break, or that she had acted in self-defense during a confrontation that spiraled into violence. The lack of a clear motive, the absence of conclusive evidence, and the closed nature of the household kept the mystery alive. In literature and pop culture, Lizzie evolved into a symbol of female rebellion, moral ambiguity, and unresolved violence. She was portrayed alternately as a tragic figure, a feminist icon, a misunderstood victim, and a calculating sociopath. This ambiguity allowed creators to project onto her whatever themes they wished to explore. Plays like Blood Relations and films such as Lizzie reimagined her story with varying degrees of historical accuracy. Even horror and gothic fiction embraced her legend, turning the Borden house into a haunted setting and Lizzie into a ghostly figure whose motives remain elusive. The Borden house itself became a site of fascination. Preserved as a bed and breakfast and museum, it draws visitors from around the world, true crime enthusiasts, paranormal investigators, and curious tourists all eager to sleep under the same roof where the infamous murders took place. The home has been featured in countless documentaries, YouTube investigations, and paranormal TV shows, reinforcing its status as a modern-day shrine to one of America's most enduring mysteries. Lizzie's story has also sparked broader discussions about justice, media influence, and the role of women in crime narratives. In academic circles, her trial is analyzed through the lenses of gender studies, legal history, and sociology. The case is cited in discussions about how societal biases can influence both investigations and jury decisions. The interplay of class, gender, and media still resonates today, making the story not just historically compelling but culturally relevant. What began as a family tragedy in a quiet New England town became a national obsession and, eventually, an enduring piece of American mythology. Lizzie Borden's name now exists in a strange space between history and legend, where truth, speculation, and storytelling intertwine. 5.